Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to Amendment 3468. Mr. Speaker, so much of the discussion since March about the governor's budget proposal has been about a severance tax. And many of us on the Republican side of the aisle and the conversations we've had back home are looking at the numbers, and the proportion of the tax increase on hardworking families versus what's discussed about the severance tax seems out of balance. It seems like 90% of the conversation is about the severance tax, yet it only represents about 10%, if that, of the governor's tax increase. But since the other side wants to make this a discussion about a severance tax for education, I haven't really understood how they could make that argument, since the governor's proposal took his severance tax revenue and didn't spend it on education. They spent it on handouts to wind and solar companies. And one of the good things in this amendment is that the Democratic chairman abandoned that philosophy. Thankfully, he abandoned the governor's proposal that spent money not on education, but on wind and solar handouts. I commend the gentleman for taking the leadership to say the deal all along was that a severance tax would be used for education, and we should live up to that commitment. I commend the gentleman for his leadership in that respect. But I also am getting frustrated when I hear that the minority chairman on the Energy and Environmental Resource Committee said that the impact fee has an effective rate of 1.9%. Well, he cited the Budget and Policy Center, which sounds like a independent, fiscally fair and balanced and politically fair and balanced organization. It's the Budget and Policy Center. But that group, let's be honest, is not neutral. They are a left-wing ideological think tank. And so let's just put the 1.9% effective rate in perspective. I actually think we should use the Independent Fiscal Office. Let's use their numbers. As they testified to the Appropriations Committee, they testified that the impact fee in 2014 was 4.7%. 4.7% effective rate in the impact fee. And now this new proposal of a severance tax is a 3.5%, plus a 4.7%, plus the 4.7% impact fee, comes out to taxing this industry at 14.1%. Throw on top of that the 9.9% corporate net income tax. And it's not like the minority chairman had mentioned whether or not these big drilling companies can afford the tax. Big oil and big gas, of course, they can afford any tax rate, really. But it's naive, if not delusional, to think they would actually stay here and pay a 14.1% plus a 9.9% tax rate. It's delusional. These companies didn't just start drilling in 2011. No, they came to Pennsylvania because we had a competitive advantage. We still have a competitive advantage today, but let's look and see where those companies are moving their resources. Are they increasing their investments in Pennsylvania? No, they're decreasing. They're moving jobs out of Pennsylvania. We've seen layoffs in Allegheny County and Beaver County and Washington County by these big drilling companies, not because they're closing their doors. They're still in business. They're moving to more competitive environments. This is not a decision about, the severance tax is not a debate about whether or not big oil or big gas can afford it. It's about where they're going to operate. And I know some of the critics of the natural gas industry haven't even stepped foot on a well site. But if you were to come visit a well pad, you would notice that these well pads may be operated by those big companies that the minority chairman mentioned. It might be an Exxon or a Chesapeake well pad, but thousands of our homegrown businesses rely on those well pads operated by these big companies. Thousands of our businesses in our districts, like Hobacres who build the well pad, McDonald Landscaping, Hugel Sanitation, Kephart Hardware, all these companies rely on these investment decisions by these big companies, and they all work and rely on the natural gas industry. So a severance tax is a tax on them. A severance tax is a tax on the Roscoe family. Mr. Roscoe, Beaver County native, changed the course of his family. He worked two full-time jobs, while raising his daughter Madison. And then in 2011, as Madison says, he changed the course of their family. He went to Newcastle School of Trade. He took a 6-week course, got a CDL license, and his next job doubled his family income. He's now sending his daughter to the University of Ohio, and he's relying on the natural gas industry as a truck driver. A severance tax is a tax on the Roscoe family. Many of us in this chamber we talk about job creation, we talk about supporting our laborers. Well, what do they think about the severance tax debate, and what do they think about the natural gas industry? Well, Chris Padron, the International Union of Operating Engineers, Local 66, this is what he said. Those in the building trades, local plumbers, boilermakers, pipe fitters, and electricians say Marcellus Shale is a godsend. Those aren't my words, those are his words. The president of Local 66. He said, quote, "It's been a real blessing for our members. A severance tax is a tax on the local plumbers, boilermakers, pipe fitters, and electricians. Not to mention that you're increasing those same folks, you're increasing their personal income tax as well." What's Dennis Martire from the Laborers Union of North America? He said, "The pipelines have been a lifeline for us. It's all about the jobs. This severance tax is a tax on those working in the pipeline." Jocelyn just posted on my Facebook page yesterday, she goes, quote, "This isn't big oil and big gas. This is my job, my community. Governor Wolf's plan is detrimental to all of us." I believe Jocelyn's right. I believe that a 14.1% severance tax is a tax on her job, and it does risk her job. And Pennsylvania leading the nation in another tax will risk her job. And Mr. Roscoe, he says, quote, "Right now, with all the layoffs that have gone on in the industry, the natural gas industry, we cannot afford to have any of these companies decide to abandon the area because of more taxes. Not only would this affect my immediate family," Mr. Roscoe says, but he says, "it's also an attack on my brothers and sisters in the patch." Mr. Roscoe, you're right. And I'm not going to vote for what's deemed a reasonable severance tax. And only in Pennsylvania can the highest in the nation be deemed as reasonable. But some have called it a reasonable or a compromise. I don't think it's much of a compromise. The severance tax isn't much of a compromise when you look at the effective rate. And the effective rate is real. It's $220 million that the industry is paying in the impact fee. And the last thing I'd like to talk about, Mr. Speaker, is the wild revenue projections we've heard over the last 19 months. A 5% severance tax back in February of 2014, Governor Wolf said would bring in $550 million. Then the same 5% tax would bring in $700 million in May. And then in September, the same 5% severance tax all of a sudden would bring in $1 billion. And in March, we heard the same thing again. A 5% severance tax would bring in $1 billion. Well, today we see that an 8.5% severance tax only brings in $65 million. So thankfully, I guess the progress for me that we can be a little satisfied about today is we are making progress, and the wild revenue projections that we've heard for 19 months have finally come to an end. And Mr. Speaker, raising taxes for us to justify time and time again to spend more money is falling on deaf ears back home. People have heard all the reasons why they need to pay more money. The natural gas industry heard why they aren't paying enough. But I feel, Mr. Speaker, that if we're going to reach a budget compromise, we need to come in grips with reality, and I do think that today is progress. I do think that we need to pass an emergency spending bill because, as we will see today, we are far from a budget and an end to this budget impasse. We should no longer hold these agencies hostage. We should fund our schools on an emergency basis. Our schools should be funded. They should have been funded 2 weeks ago, because clearly by today's bill and the vote that is to come, we are far from a budget. I urge a no vote, and I urge the governor to sign the next emergency spending bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.